2 years after I completed my residency training, I was working in an emergency department in Minneapolis, and a woman who had been battered by her husband for the 3rd time in 6 months was rolled in to the emergency department, and I shook my head in frustration, having seen her twice before, and wondered to myself, what is she thinking? I walked into her room and I said, "You need to leave this guy, he's gonna kill you." She sat up, her left eye was swollen shut. With her right eye, she could see me well enough to grab my shirt collar, and she stood up and backed me into the wall. And she said, "I've left him 3 times. I've lived in shelters, I've gotten counseling, I've moved me and my kids 3 times. I have restraining orders in 2 counties. What else would you like me to do?" I stood there silent, not being able to give her an answer, and feeling entirely incompetent as a physician, and ashamed as a human being. When I look back on my educational journey, it's not really surprising to me that I ended up there inside my head. Our educational journeys are similar in that we can really tightly begin to tie our ability to know an answer to our human competence. And it's really important, if we're talking about discovery, to really sort out what is competence when it comes to discovery. How does it link to the way we've been conditioned to think of ourselves as smart? Personal development and inner awareness is one of the biggest things that needs to happen if we're going to do discovery and leadership. And I'm going to share some of my journey. I had a midlife crisis. I'm Norwegian and Lutheran, so no one noticed. So inside, I was suffering from some turmoil. And the turmoil was really, am I going to continue to run on the treadmill of the medical industrial complex? That treadmill is getting bigger and bigger and bigger if you look at our spending curve. And my relationship and ability to execute with a patient in front of me felt smaller and smaller and smaller. It was very daunting to think of leaping off that treadmill because there's status on the treadmill, there's income on the treadmill. I feel like an expert much of the time on the treadmill, which lines up well with my definition of competence coming through the educational journey that I was on. But it was a treadmill that is unsustainable for me, for patients, and for our community. So I leapt off into uncertainty. And the thing that was most surprising is I landed right in the arms of my colleagues who were feeling the same thing, but we weren't talking about it in a way that really connected to our hearts and minds. We were spending a lot of time complaining about somebody else not fixing our problems, instead of realizing that most of what we need to fix inside the system has to do with us. And it has to do with us recognizing the role patients need to play, the role we need to play, and the nuance between telling people what to do and engaging them in a real conversation, which is something I wasn't taught. So my goal today is to talk about my inner conversation, my conversation with my colleagues, which should give us great hope because they are making tremendous progress and their work is actually inspirational. And then I need to talk about something else, and that is we all have a role in health reform. We can't do what we need to do if the public doesn't change its mindset about what health really is and the role we all need to play. So after the woman pushed me up against the wall, I actually went on a 6-month journey visiting domestic violence shelters. I sat down in the first shelter and I told the story about the woman pushing me into the wall, and a woman in the back room stood up and said, "You go, girl." They were angry and frustrated with people like me who told them answers to questions without even having an understanding of what they faced. That was eye-opening, but I was smart enough to be there with the intent to learn, and I listened. And I actually shared my guilt and my shame with them. And amazingly, they shared theirs with me, and I learned what I needed to learn. I changed my practice. A couple of years later, I got a call from a big health plan, and they said, Dave, we have a patient that saw you in the emergency department 14 months ago. We also know you've been doing some work on domestic violence. Wondered if you would come. She'll speak first, you speak second. Educate some physicians. So I showed up that night, and the social worker introduced a woman I'll call Diane. She had seen me 14 months ago on a night that she'd been beaten in her home. She got home from work late, she said, and when I got home, my husband was jealous and intoxicated, and he punched me in the eye. And he threw me into the wall, and I crawled into the bathroom, locked the door, and leaned against the door as he pounded on it for 2 hours. Fortunately, he didn't blow the door down. Eventually, he was drunk enough to need to lay down, and he fell asleep. I fell asleep curled up on the bathroom floor. 3 in the morning, I woke up, and I saw myself in the mirror, and the white of my eye was completely purple, and I could barely close my eye, and I was frightened to death. I usually weathered these storms alone, and had never gone to see a physician about this. I decided that night to go into the emergency department, so I drove into central Minneapolis because it's not near my home, and I went in and told the nurse that I'd slipped and fallen and hit the tub. I went into the room where to be examined, and Dr. Moen came in, and I told him the same story. He said, what you have around your eye is like a bruise on your arm. It will heal in 7 to 10 days. But the next thing he said changed the trajectory of my life. He said, I need to learn more about your injuries. Is it okay if I touch you? She went on to say I'd never experienced that in the hands of a man. 2 weeks later, she told a friend about her situation. And a couple months after that, hooked up with a counselor, and this night she was standing free from her relationship. So let's talk about another scenario. We'll say I need a volunteer up here. I call on Joe. He comes up. He's walking toward me. As he's walking toward me, he's turning blue. He falls on the ground, has a short seizure, and stops breathing. You all know I'm an emergency physician for 20 years. You have expectations about what you think I should do. I lean down, check his airway. It's clear. I blow some air into his mouth. Seems like it's going into his lungs. And I turn to you and say, does someone have a cell phone? Can you call 911? Does someone know CPR? Can you two come up? And can someone go get us a defibrillator and bring it back? Then we start doing CPR. Shortly, the defibrillator arrives. We put the patches on the chest. The defibrillator delivers a shock. He opens his eyes, takes a breath. We're relieved. Ambulance comes. He goes to the hospital. We take a break. You come back in and sit down. This is the part of the story that I'm going to really like. I come in and you give me a standing ovation. That is what I thought my job was going to be. That's what I really sensed was my role. And when I got into the world of practice, that ended up being not very common. Yet, much of my training was about what I did in that scenario, which was know what to do, direct others to play a role, and make that work as rapidly as possible. Every minute that goes by that man doesn't have a defibrillator on his chest, his chance of survival drops by 10%. The idea is to get it done quickly and right. There's a real difference there in terms of leadership styles between how I would interact with Joe and how I'd interact with Diane. And I was really prepared for Joe and completely unprepared for Diane. Yet if you look at the problem we're trying to solve in health, we really aren't preparing our medical professionals, all of them, I'll say, to take on the world that's in front of us. And we have consequences of that all over our society because we're avoiding some of the conversations we need to have, and our professions are not playing a role in leading the dialogue around this change. If you look here, behavior is the major piece of your life, our life, that matters in terms of our health. Behavior means what we put in our mouth, how much we exercise, what we choose to do with our time, what we believe. We do know a fair amount about behavior in terms of what drives behavior. Beliefs drive behavior. In the scenario with Diane, what was key that she received from me was a sense of respect and compassion from a male that was different than she'd experienced on her entire journey. She did not need me to tell her to leave her relationship. In fact, that might even disenfranchise her, might tick her off. It was critical to see that differently than running a cardiac arrest. Behavior change follows 3 steps: believe, know, and act. Belief comes first. In our health systems, in our world, we sometimes focus on know, and we forget belief. Belief is heart activity. It's a sense that you trust the person you're talking to. We have got to learn how to embed skills to help people believe in themselves if we're going to empower patients to take control of their lives. Today, our biggest behavioral issue in our population is obesity. 1/2 of the weight gain in the United States in the last several decades is due to soda pop, sugared drinks disguised as fruit juice, and sports drinks, which is amazing that they're called sports drinks. They should be called get fat drinks. We've distributed them very efficiently to our school systems. We've also placed addictive substances in them. Sugar is an addictive substance. Fascinating that we can't take that conversation on, yet we're all talking about health reform. Our biggest health issue is right in front of us. We need to stop distributing sugared drinks. We need to begin to take on that dialogue. That's not Obamacare or death panels. That's about us. It's about democracy. Let's talk about social determinants of health and environmental. Together, they account for more effect on your health than the entire healthcare system. That means, do I have a sense of belonging? Do I attend a faith community? Do I have friends? Do I live in a neighborhood that's safe? All that together is what has twice the effect on our population as all the hospitals, clinics, doctors, surgeries, chemotherapy agents, antibiotics. Those things have twice the effect. The other important piece of science that has emerged is around genetics. We have now deciphered the genetic code, and we were deluding ourselves into thinking that once we deciphered the code, we'd have the key to a big chunk of health. And we do have the key. You're born with a genetic code, and there are very few conditions that that code determines your future at birth. Very few. There's a whole science of epigenetics. And epigenetics is what happens on the genetic code. It's the proteins. And guess what they're influenced by? Your behavior, the environment, social factors. So we have a lot to learn about how we think of health. And our challenge is to redefine what we think about health. So where I get hope from my colleagues are from projects like a project called Zero Birth Injury. In 2008, there were 460 women and children injured during birth at one of our large hospitals that delivers thousands of babies. That's the expected rate. That's normal. What happened in that community is the clinicians who deliver those babies, not just doctors. All clinicians who deliver those babies got together and said, this isn't acceptable. Instead of going for a 10% reduction, we're going to go for 0, zip, none. Birth injuries are defined as neonatal death, admission to an ICU for a newborn, a maternal transfusion, a 3rd or 4th degree laceration in the mother. These are serious events. This isn't just a little bit of stimulation at birth and the baby breathes. These are big events. What happened in that group is they owned the problem. As clinicians, they owned the problem. They also instilled belief in a group of clinicians that this was worthy of their time and investment because none of them got paid to do this. So it was a sense of purpose that really hooked back into the heart of why they became clinicians that drove this work. In 2011, there were 50 birth injuries, 460 to 50. So while we're all chatting about health reform in Washington and lobbyists are getting wealthy running around preaching, I just want you to know that clinicians in this community right here have taken it on. And whatever happens in Washington, it will happen because we can't sustain this treadmill anymore. When I was a 4th year medical student, I took care of a gentleman for 6 weeks who had manic depressive illness, psychosis, post-traumatic stress disorder. It's the first day of my psychiatric rotation. He came in to the emergency department, wildly psychotic and paranoid, stricken with fear. I went in to see him in the room. He didn't talk to me. He talked to everyone else that I couldn't see. We put him in a room, gave him sedatives to help him sleep, fed him, cleaned him, and in 2 weeks he entered a state called mania. Mania is a fascinating thing to watch, and I was so fortunate as a student because the psychiatrist I was working with made us spend 1 hour every day with each patient. And we sat and watched. For 4 weeks, I didn't get a word in. John spoke, and I listened. Mania is an amazing state of mind. It's irrational exuberance, unbridled creativity. Some of the most gorgeous works of art, music, paintings have been created during mania when the right brain is unbridled by the left in a person with creativity. But it can also cause problems if you end up in a casino. So there are downsides to irrational exuberance. So John then transitioned to a state of two-way conversation for about 4 days. And for the first time, he and I had a dialogue. On his last day of hospitalization, he walked down the hall. It was a clean, sterile hall, typical of a VA psychiatric unit. His hair was pulled back in a ponytail and clean. He was clean-shaven. He had clean clothes on, and he took a piece of paper out of his pocket, and he handed it to me. And he said, "Someday you'll know what this means." And he disappeared through the doors into the community, and I opened the paper and looked at what he'd written. I then tucked it back into my pocket, and it slid into the subconscious of my mind. It emerged in the disequilibrium of my midlife crisis. It was on the wall of nearly every conscious thought I had, and I could not understand why. But I think I now understand why John gave me the poem. Wild hope hiding in the desert with cactus and strange blossoms. When your time comes, recall that I spoke of your incidental beauty. I've never found the origin of that poem or connected with John again, but I now realize this is our time. It's time for this conversation to move from someone like me, from my colleagues, to all of you, our community. We have a challenge in front of us, and it's a real challenge. And we as clinicians in your community cannot solve it alone. We need your help now. We've had to summon courage to deal with the fear, the anger, the frustration of our colleagues as we push through changes that bump into their autonomy, their mindset, their competence, all those things. We collectively have a challenge as we take on our community, and politicians will create pockets of certainty on each side of the debate when the answer actually lies in the middle, and will require us to face into ambiguity and actually touch discovery, which will harvest the collective wisdom that sits in rooms like this, which is what we need to do. Our challenge is to redefine health, not just as the absence of disease. We need to redefine health as the ever-presence of our well-being. In that work, we will discover our joy, nested in the hands of human compassion. Thank you.